Upon discovering a new Pokemon fan game, it can often be pretty easy to decide whether or not you want to play it. Maybe the stunning visuals hooked you in, or the plot description was right up your alley. But sometimes, you might also find yourself pondering for way too long about whether or not you should dump 20 hours into the one you just discovered. After all, despite being free to play games, your free time is still quite valuable. So in today's video, I'll be taking a look at 5 completed Pokemon fan games that most of the community has had mixed feelings about, or ones that have just flown under the radar, deciding both for myself and all of you watching if they're worth playing in 2025, with a 0 to 100% measurement at the end of each segment. So without further ado, my name is Ari, and let's get started. The first game on this list is Pokemon Hidden Place. This was a project that got quite a bit of praise from YouTubers around its English release, but saw a lot less from smaller voices in the community, and even various amounts of criticism. So I decided to pick it up and see for myself what it had to offer. In Hidden Place, you play as a Pokemon trainer who's been tasked by the small town professor with traveling across the region to uncover some of its secrets and ancient history. In doing so, you'll also take part in the Sacred Tour, which requires you to visit 8 locations around the region and complete their trials. From a gameplay perspective, it is pretty identical to the Gym Challenge. I don't think the writing was bad, but even with a few translation issues aside, there weren't any characters or even story beats that stood out to me. The rivals, gym leaders, and evil team all felt very average. But I guess expecting every fan game I pick up to have a mind-blowing story is a little unrealistic. So what about the gameplay? Hidden Place offers Pokemon up to the 9th generation. I can't exactly confirm if it's all of them, though it is at least most of them. There are a few Fakeamon, including your starters, but if you aren't a fan of those, I think they'll be pretty easy to ignore, considering they make up less than 5% of the regional dex. It also has a quality of life feature that makes your team very easy to not just train, but keep equally on par. It's a configurable system that allows you to control which members of your team share experience after battle, meaning if one of your Pokemon overleveled too quickly, you can disable their EXP share so that it's more focused on the rest of the team. That, alongside an in-party mover learner, removes a lot of the grinding you'd normally have to do. However, I'll admit that the difficulty level this game offered was pretty boring. On paper, a lot of important trainer teams are pretty well assembled, but the AI almost always just chooses to hit you with random attacks, removing the need for really any strategy whatsoever. Finally, although this is more of a nitpick that probably won't matter to most people, I feel Hidden Place has a bit of an identity crisis when it comes to its overworld. Any map that takes place in a grassy forest or plains area looks pretty good, and has a nice amount of detail. Everywhere else though, especially caves, feels really lacking. Overall, I don't think Hidden Place is a bad game. It's got some translation issues with a lot of Pokemon moves, but other than that, you can expect a pretty average Pokemon experience. I'm going to be giving it a 75% on the playability scale. You'll definitely enjoy it if you're just looking for another Pokemon fan game to play, but if you want something with more thought-provoking gameplay or story elements, I think you're better off looking elsewhere. Now, I'm sure just about all of you watching have at least had an idea of what your ideal Pokemon game could look like. Maybe it's set in a new region with new Pokemon, or even an existing one with a completely different story. But I'm almost certain that the most popular idea or concept would be a game with every mainline region. And that's pretty much what this game is, one where you play as Ash Ketchum through his entire adventure across the first 8 regions. But okay, why is a game like this even on this list? Surely a project with 8 regions should be an immediately must-play, right? Well, not exactly, and I'll break down just about why. But this is Pokemon Fire Ash. A fan game that I mentioned before follows the adventures of Ash throughout his journey within the anime. The most important thing this game needs to get right, in my opinion, is how accurately it portrays that. And let's just say it really doesn't. Now, I will admit that the official forum post about the project does state that it quote-unquote loosely follows his journey, but it does so by missing out on like 95% of the anime events, and even the ones that do exist can barely even be completed properly as they were in the anime. I felt like I was just playing through Fire Red with Ash's team, which might not bother you if that's what you're looking for, but it's very far from even loosely following his adventures. Now, of course, even with that criticism aside, this is still a game with 8 different regions, so surely that can offer an experience to be enjoyed, right? Well, Fire Ash uses the Fire Red and Leaf Green tile set to map every location in the game, and while it's not an awful style, it is one that lacks the tools to create any of the more diverse locations outside of Kanto. So not only will many of the routes and towns barely resemble their intended counterparts, they will also just look completely identical to each other. I'm going to be brutally honest, this game takes an extremely quantity over quality approach, which you might argue is kind of necessary for a game with 8 regions. But it's still valid to criticize, and I would even say that a project that only focused on one of the anime adventures, with much more attention to the events that occur there, would be way better than attempting to shove them all into a single game. So unfortunately, I'm going to have to give Fire Ash a 30% on the playability scale. It does at least offer the ability to play through the 8 regions with his team, which I can't say is something that any other fan game has done before, but if you're looking for an experience more faithful to the anime, you're quite literally better off playing the 2010 ROM hack Ash Gray, or even just waiting for future projects that focus on it. Unlike the last two, this next game isn't one that I found the community feeling necessarily mixed about, rather one that I think has gone pretty unnoticed, despite not even looking that bad. But this is Pokemon Mauve, and I apologize if I pronounced that wrong. In this game, you'll take on the role as a young trainer about to graduate and begin their adventure. On your journey, you'll be able to catch every single canon Pokemon. They're easy to locate thanks to the overworld encounter system, effortless to train with the optional EXP all, and they'll even follow behind you. I think the Pokemon side of the gameplay was mostly alright. The early variety is extremely strong, and there is a decent amount of optional content like raid dens. And while the battle AI and animations were a bit subpar, they probably won't drag down the experience too much. However, this game's biggest feat is probably the fact that it not only includes a new region to explore, but also the entirety of Kanto, Johto, and Hoenn as well. So with 4 regions, that leaves you with at least 100 hours of playable content. Although, even with such an insane accomplishment, I do have to admit that the game does start to fall apart when it comes to the story. The writing felt very basic, and most story beats didn't feel like they served any purpose other than telling you where to go next. It's also worth mentioning that about 30% of the dialogue just isn't translated to English, though that might not be something that bothers you, as I didn't really have a hard time trying to figure out where to go next despite that. I also found that a lot of routes and towns of the main region felt very similar to that from the 4th generation, not just in the art style, but some of them feeling quite literally ripped from Sinnoh, which kind of ruined its identity as its own region. But just like the first game on this list, and despite the flaws I mentioned, I don't think it's a bad game. Just a far from perfect one that you're likely to enjoy if you don't desire a game with an extremely unique region or an engaging story. Rather, an adventure across 4 regions with every Pokemon available. So for that reason, I'm going to give Mauve a 70% on the playability scale. Up next is Pokemon Reunion, a fan game that's been praised incredibly highly in the French-speaking community and by many content creators, some even claiming it to be the best Pokemon fan game of 2024. However, I did feel a bit skeptical about that claim, especially with how much criticism I've witnessed in smaller communities, and from the little bit I've played in the past. But of course, wanting to form and voice a proper opinion on the game, I had to give it another try. So in Pokemon Reunion, you'll take on the role of the Pokemon Master Red, having recently returned from their journey, and now must answer a new danger, being ultra wormholes appearing all over, causing panic and destruction everywhere in their path. Since this is a story-focused game, you'll constantly be facing off against different enemies and meeting new allies. I personally thought the writing was alright. There were definitely a few moments that stood out to me, but I also felt as if the writer prioritized shoving in as many iconic characters as they could for hype moments and nostalgia, rather than actually writing a good story. Not to say it's bad, but I definitely think it could have been much better. Although, I can personally excuse or even ignore a story I didn't like, as long as the gameplay side can make up for it. But that, unfortunately, wasn't the case. My main gripe with the project is its gameplay. You see, Reunion starts you off with Red's full team, all at level 80. Now, I do get that for story purposes, Red would obviously have his most powerful team, as he just returned from his journey, but I also don't see why he couldn't have just had his team set to a lower level, or even stolen from him, forcing us to build a new one. Such a plot point wouldn't even be as far-fetched compared to the rest of the game's content either. Instead, however, there's just no sense of progression, just battles with a full team of Pokemon you never grew alongside of. I can't lie that even if the story was as enjoyable as the ones from my favorite fan games, I'd still have a negative overall experience thanks to this design philosophy. With that said though, I do at least want to point out a few redeeming qualities in spite of that. First of all, obviously, my opinion on the story isn't going to be universal, and there's a chance you might really like it yourself. Secondly, the game does look really good visually. The overworld maps are very pretty, and the custom character art is well made. Finally though, if you yourself, or perhaps someone you know, primarily speaks French over English, then you or them can enjoy this game to its fullest, with that being the language it was originally created with. But still, the lack of much progression with your Pokemon seriously held me back from enjoying it. And while I think the game could be heavily enjoyed if you don't care about that aspect, it's still an incredibly core concept of Pokemon's gameplay. So taking everything I've said into account, I will have to be giving Pokemon Reunion a 40% on the playability scale, a number that would be at least double that if it weren't for the lack of Pokemon progression. Moving on is another fan game I also felt received less attention than it deserved. Probably even more so than the third game I talked about in this video. But this is Pokemon Chaos in Vizita. Like the first and third game on this list, you'll play as a brand new trainer who's had the opportunity to receive a rare starter Pokemon and travel across a brand new region. The first thing I'll compliment about this game is its overworld. Every map is constructed very well, leaving you with routes that are fun to progress through, towns that stand out among each other, and, well, just pretty maps to look at as a whole. Not only do they look and feel good to play through though, but the region is also incredibly diverse. My journey across it was definitely my favorite part of the entire game, but to many others, I'm sure you care much more about the Pokemon. Chaos in Vizita offers not just every Pokemon from the first 6 generations, but also 31 new custom forms and 16 new Mega Evolutions. With both the EXPL and a free mover learner at your PC, both building and customizing your team will be incredibly easy. The only gripe I really had with the actual battles was only a massive lack of move animations, to the point where I kind of just turned them off to save time. Other than that though, you can expect a somewhat above vanilla difficulty level, where important enemies will have decent coverage, but won't often have full teams of Pokemon. The part of the game that did kind of disappoint me though was the story. From what I read on the download page, it really looked like I was getting into a lore-heavy plot with tons of unique characters and story beats. What I got though was basically just your average Pokemon adventure, which, don't get me wrong, isn't a bad thing, but I guess don't go into the game expecting an out-of-this-world story. One extra thing I do want to mention though is that this game does also offer a German translation, a language that I'm under the impression lacks a huge fan game scene compared to the English and Spanish speaking ones. So if you have a friend who primarily speaks German and likes Pokemon, then this is definitely a fan game I would suggest to them. Overall, I think Chaos in Vizita deserves an 80% on the playability scale. Despite its story being very average, the rest of the game is pretty fun, making an enjoyable experience if you don't desire a more unique or high quality story. So this next game is admittedly kind of an honorable mention, as I discovered it almost at the last minute, but also thought that it would be one of the many you could enjoy. This is Pokemon Aurelion, which is another simple fan game where you play as a brand new Pokemon trainer on a journey across a new region. And while I'm sure you might be sick of playing through projects like that, especially those with more grounded or average levels of storytelling, I do think this one has some redeeming qualities that make it worth playing. But like the last game, Aurelion does have a pretty overworld and a good region design, with both a diverse environment, maps constructed well using a custom Generation 3 tile set, and even some additional details like overworld encounters. The region's Pokédex consists of about 400 Pokemon from the first 8 generations. I want to say the variety was pretty average, not bad, but my early options were very similar to those in dozens of other fan games I've played in the past. But the game's difficulty level isn't super challenging either, so forcing yourself to build an early team won't be a requirement in order to be successful. Although I should at least mention that this game does use the doubles format over singles as its primary battle format. As for the story, it's again very average. Take on the 8 gym leaders and defeat a not so interesting evil team. However, I will say that the lack of a story did make the game's pacing feel a lot quicker. You will be able to finish a full playthrough in a short amount of time while still feeling satisfied with your adventure. Overall, it might just seem like your average fan game, but other than that opinion, there isn't much else wrong with it. So I will be giving Pokemon Aurelion a 75% on the playability scale. Closing out this video, I did want to say that my intention with the games that possess lower scores was not to put them down or really insult them in any way. Instead, provide constructive criticism to the developers, but also perhaps educate current and future ones, helping them avoid making the same mistakes. I also feel a lot of fan games get a lot of one-sided attention from YouTubers, praising them to an extremely high level to up their video view counts, and perhaps leaving those same developers with less of a reason to listen to the smaller voices in the community, providing much more unbiased feedback. So I do think it's sometimes necessary to visit the projects myself and often repeat that same unbiased criticism as one of those larger voices. But anyways, I do hope you enjoyed this video and were even able to find something new to play. Thank you to my channel members for their continuous support, and have a nice rest of your day.